school in the mid-'80s, we were 55% female in our class.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, we are going to get started. My name is Mitchell Desjardins. Let's get this pose set up. Come back here.
Okay.
My name is Mitchell Desjardins, and I'm a teacher here at SCI-Arc. And today I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Alan Sondheim. I'm going to give you a brief rundown on his, it's better like this, on his background. I can see you. This is good. Are we on? We're on.
We're very on.
All right. Alan Sondheim is a writer, teacher, and cyberspace theorist who co-moderates the email list, Cybermind, Fiction of Philosophy, and eConf on the internet. The first is devoted to the psychology philosophy of cyberspace. Sections of his internet text have appeared in perforations and other publications. He has recently edited Being Online Net Subjectivity for the Lusitania Press and guest edited an issue of Art Papers on Future Culture. His other books include Individuals, Post-Movement Art in America, and Disorders of the Real. His current project, The Internet Text, is available on the World Wide Web. Sondheim has a book of art theory essays forthcoming from Gordon and Breach. He is also editing a special issue of New Observations on Net Culture, Jennifer, a collection of some of his online texts, which was published this year by the Nominative Press Collective. Sondheim has published over 130 articles and has lectured at a number of venues on Internet and Information Highway. He teaches, Internet culture is difficult. He lectures
Internet culture is difficult.
on issues of online culture and community, including Lane College and the New School for Social Research. His film and video has been exhibited at 2 Whitney Biennales as well as the Paris Biennale. Sondheim has received 3 residencies at the Experimental Television Center. He has been a visiting lecturer at UCLA, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, Ontario College of Art and Concordia University of Texas at Dallas, and UC Irvine. His film and video have been shown internationally. Sondheim has participated in numerous shows, including Crash, Nostalgia for the Absence of Cyberspace. He has taken part in and occasionally run a number of conferences on cyberspace issues. My throat is constricted.
Okay.
In November 96, Sondheim was a keynote speaker at the Cybermind conference in Perth, Australia.
We could let it go there.
We could stop.
Yes,
Sondheim
stop.
has an MA from
more.
Brown and currently lives in Brooklyn. I must say, having visited his website on the Internet Text for the first time a week ago, I felt I was reading the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time in my life. I'm very pleased to present Alan Sondheim.
There were 2 things I could talk about. I've been talking around the Southland, and there were 2 things I could talk about. One was things dealing with the geography of the internet, and the other was just sort of an introduction to my work. And I think I'm going to go for the introduction to my work because it's probably a little more bizarre and a little more interesting. I've been on the internet about 5 years nonstop, and one of the first things I started doing was running some email lists. I don't know how familiar you are with the internet. I've been talking to different ranges of audiences, from people who aren't even getting email to people who know what an RFC is. So I'll assume here somewhere in the middle. An email list is an ongoing conference on the internet that uses email as a way of sending and receiving posts to the conference. You send out your own personal response to something to a central site, and it's distributed to all the people that subscribe. And I've been running 2 of them nonstop. One of them is called Cybermind, Philosophy and Psychology of Cyberspace, and the other is called Fiction of Philosophy. The Cybermind list is interesting because it's one of the things that brought about the reality and the depth of cyberspace to me. I started it with a man I had never met, Michael Current, who lived in Iowa. And about a month after we started the list together, he died. And we had become very close friends before that, but we didn't have any physical contact. And yet I was the one to send the elegy out across the internet list. I was in touch with his, across the internet, I was in touch with his mother and his lover in, I forget what city it was in. at this point, and I was getting condolence calls, telephone calls, and email. I mean, I must have received about 15 or 20 telephone calls from people I didn't know about a man I had never met, with people crying on the phone. So it brought to me the power of the internet very much home. And the Cybermind email list is still going. We've run conferences. We have books come out of it. We've been studied by ethnographers, sociologists, and linguists. We've been subject to spam and to hacking attacks. We've had to move sites 4 times. We've met in all sorts of different cities in real life. There have been some marriages that have come out of the list. There have been a lot of marriages that have broken up as a result of the email list, because one of the things that happens when you run something like this is very quickly, well, within a year or so, the list settles down into a form of global community in which you have several striations, several populations at work all at once. You've got what are called lurkers, who are the people who are just sitting on the list, not saying anything. That's the majority of people. It's like 85–90% of the people on an email list won't say anything. Then you have 20 to 30 people who are actually sending out posts. And they're the ones who sort of determine the direction of the list. They're the ones who are addicted to writing on it. And then you have newbies who come on and just sort of try to see what the list is about and will eventually introduce themselves. So I've been running the Cybermind list since then, another list dealing with fictional and philosophical texts called Fiction of Philosophy. It's been going since around the same time. And then I'm also co-moderating a list called eConf, which stands for Electronic Conferencing. And because Cybermind has turned, at this point, more into a community than a research list, I'm also starting another list with a few people called Cyberculture, which will again deal with the culture of cyberspace, but in a slightly more formal way. I just want to mention as an aside that I was interested that Mike Davis is teaching here, because the kind of homeowners enclaves, homeowners associations that he talks about in his work are also something that's becoming increasingly prevalent on the internet through the establishment of firewalls, but also through the need of things even like these email lists to protect themselves against people coming in trying to steal all the addresses in order to send spam privately, or trying to send spam directly to the list, or trying to break the list down or hack into the list or cause trouble. So there is a lot of sort of defensive fortification work going on all over the internet right now, and the internet as a result, unfortunately, is changing tremendously as a result of this. When I started getting online in a more or less intensive manner, I became very interested in what I call virtual subjectivity, what it means to be a subject online, to have your being online, to have a net relationship with someone which may be very intense. It may turn towards sex, it may turn towards real-life marriage or real-life depression, real-life divorce, this kind of thing. The real and the virtual for so many people interpenetrate that it becomes very difficult to tell them apart. So I became interested in virtual subjectivity, and I started writing about it very early on. I started writing this thing called the internet text. This display that's on my right is a JavaScript page that continually refreshes itself randomly and brings up different colors. You can see that there's more contrast on the actual computer page there, but it brings up different colors representing different parts of the body. And this is a character called Jennifer that I work through. So this is a page that I call a Jennifer function. I'll explain more about what that's about. But if I back up here, if I can back up here, is there a mouse? There's a mouse. I think that's going to take me back. Wait, no, that's not what I want. I'm trying to get back. I can't see what I'm doing. Yeah, I'll turn the screen. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. Because if worse comes to worse, I can go to history here and go back that way. Let me see what happens. Okay, here. This is a page which is going to be completely unreadable, but this just shows you what I've got set up. I have 2 websites. This one's out of Australia, which I like better because it's broader. There's another one in Virginia, and these websites have the entire internet text that I've been writing on them. The text is now about 3,000 pages, and it's indexed. The Australian one also has JavaScript pages that I've done and graphics and so forth. It's called Philosophy and Psychology of the Internet. You can access it fairly easily. There's a picture on it of stromatolites, which are my favorite. Stromatolites are my favorite life form, and I'm going to take an aside and tell you what stromatolites are, because everybody should know about stromatolites. Although it has nothing to do with this lecture series except for 3 billion years, which is a fairly long period of time, about a fifth the age of the solar system, stromatolites were the only global community you had on the planet. They're the oldest life form that has left fossils on the planet. These are living ones about 60 miles south of Perth, Australia. They're very rare, and what they are, it's sort of hard to see the scale, but this is about 4 feet across. Each of these modules is about 4 feet across, and they live in very saline waters, in estuaries or saline lakes that have no inlet and outlet, so that the salt reaches such a level that the only thing that can survive, in fact, are the stromatolites. They're very, very delicate, and they are basically bacterial algal mats. Very, very primitive bacteria in alliance with primitive algae, sort of similar to lichens, but they're underwater, and they grow and create, as they continually grow, they lay down a substrate of rock, which grows at the height of about 1 millimeter a year. So these things are about 10,000 years old, these particular stromatolite formations. I'm judging just by the, the height of them and the number of millimeters that are in it. And they look like rocks that are just slightly green on the top, and it's only the top millimeter layer that's alive. Anyway, be that as it may, let me see if this works. Yeah, this is a description of the internet text, and down here is the actual files of the text. There's internet text net 1 through net 14. Right above that there's an index to the text, so you can find out what you want to look for, where it would be. For example, if you look up netsex, you'll find a reference to these other files. There's related images that are there. Then down below there's a whole series. There are 2 VRML pieces. I'm pretty broad in all of this stuff. There's View, which is a GIF, an animated GIF, and there's some other graphics that are there. Then there's the internet text proper beyond net 1 and 14. All of these files, like JQ, it's hard for me to read from here, it's probably harder for you to see it, KD, KE, each of these is a file. Every one of these things is a file that's about 40 pages long, so there's thousands of pages here all together when these are all put together, and they make up the text. And following it, there's a novel called a Novel, and then following that, there's The Case of the Real, which has just been published as 2 chapbooks out of Connecticut. And it's an extended meditation on internet and on virtual reality. But unlike the files, which are composed of shorter pieces, The Case of the Real is a long meditation. It's 80 pages long, one continuous body of work. Then there's a resume, then there's some keywords that are here, related links, and it pretty much comes to an end. This site's also run at the Spoon Collective, which is a collective of philosophy lists. If you're subscribed to things like Avant-Garde or Film Theory or Deleuze-Guattari, any of these lists, or Foucault, any of these lists are going to be on the Spoons Collective. Cybermind started on the Spoons Collective, moved off, but the website is still there. What I do is I tend to write these texts every day, so I'll write between 1 and 3 pages every day and then send them to the email list. And I'll write under my own name, but I also write under various characters, and it's very hard to explain briefly or even keep your interest up without you getting the experience of seeing these things online. But there are 3 characters I work with other than myself. I work with myself as Alan. I work with a character called Jennifer, who's about 13 years old. I work with Julu, which is sort of a dark character, and I work with Nikka Ko, who is a Japanese character. All of these characters sort of interpenetrate, and the texts are sent out very often under their names. But it's not like I'm trying to disguise who I am. Anybody who's looked at my work for more than a week knows that all of these 4 characters, myself included, are coming from one and the same source, although sometimes I'll spoof addresses. And what I do with these characters is I try to investigate the depth psychology, in a sense, or the psychoanalytics of what it means to live online. And again, because I know the title of this talk is Global Community, it's literally trying to live in cyberspace where you have very different kinds of articulations other than physical articulations telling you where you are. There are physical relationships between being in cyberspace and the physical space that one might be in that have to do with lag, with delay, timing, and sites going down and so forth. But pretty much you have a dispersed character. If you have a character online like a Jennifer or a Julu, that character is sort of splayed out across the globe. Usually Cybermind, for example, which receives the post, usually Cybermind has between 36 and 40 countries represented on it. So and the countries are all over the place. We had our conference in Perth, Australia, in physical reality. We had for a long time our archives were in Finland. Now they're somewhere in Texas. I'm running it out of New York, and I don't even know where the AOL machine is, like what state the AOL machine is. I think it's Virginia, but I'm really not sure even where our site is that we're running this thing out of. So it's very, very dispersed, and so the texts go everywhere, and the emanations tend to be sort of geographically dispersed as well, the Jennifer, the Julu, and the Nikka Ko and myself. Nikka Ko is a real interesting character to me because Nikka Ko, among other things, is a very primitive hacker. So to give you an example of how this kind of thing will work, I can describe, if you know Internet Relay Chat, I can describe what she's done on Internet Relay Chat. Internet Relay Chat is like a chat room on AOL. It's where people talk to each other, okay? But it's on one level much more primitive because it uses, you don't need to go into Windows or into a Mac operating system to access it. You don't need a graphic interface. You can go in on what's called a shell account. It's very, very simple. Internet Relay Chat is also worldwide. It's the most primitive chat thing in that level, but it's also, in some levels, the most sophisticated because it's the easiest to hack, to break into, to create troubles. And you get teenage hackers breaking in a lot and wars going on, and you can create real havoc on Internet Relay Chat. The most popular chat sites and the most popular activity on the Internet is sex. You'll find sex everywhere on the Internet. The most popular news group is alt-sex bondage. When you're on Internet Relay Chat, you'll probably find between 75 and 80% of the chats, of the channels, what are called channels, in other words, the subjects you can talk about, between 75 and 80% of them are sex lines. So sex is everywhere on the Internet, and if you want to create a large audience, you'll go to a sex channel. This channel I usually go to is a channel called Sex, which is, you know, because it's instead of going to teenage sluts or big boobies, you know, I'll go to sex. On the sex channel, there'll be about 50 people on at any one time. So to give you an example of like the kind of stuff I've been doing, Nikka Ko, I went in as Nikka Ko, as this character Nikka Ko, who's a female Japanese. I went into the sex channel on Internet Relay Chat as Nikka Ko. And when I went in, I described myself as something like big-breasted or want to fuck or something like that. In other words, I gave it a line that I knew would be a tag. Now, what happens mainly on the sex channels is that they're mainly males talking to males disguised as females anyway. So you get, and most of the males are probably about 15 to 17-year-olds. So you get males coming on to males, and you get sort of like a loose kind of talk, and people saying, hey, if you're a woman and want to have sex with me, you know, call me up online, or here's my phone number, or whatever. I mean, it's pretty kind of desperate activity. But it's also interesting because here you have a community of males whose hormones have gone through their skulls, and it's interesting to create interferences there. So what Nikka Ko did, as an example of the sorts of things that she's done, is she comes on with the come on, okay, which a lot of males would do, but she makes it come on really, really explicit. So she comes on really, really hot. And then it's interesting to watch the screen when that happens, because the screen, when you're scrolling, you have IRC people talking back and forth like on a chat room. You have all sorts of voices scrolling, but when somebody is privately messaging you, the video reverses, so you have white text on black, so the whole line is dark with white text instead of black text on white, and that's a sign that somebody is privately messaging you. You know, they don't want other people to hear. So when you come on as Nikka Ko, big-breasted, wanna fuck or whatever, you suddenly see what I call the male swarm go quiet publicly. And privately, my screen fills up with private messages. The screen changes color because I've got the swarm coming towards me, right? So all of these males are attracted because they all want to have sex with me, and they're all sending private messages to me to have sex with. And instead of having sex with them, generally what I'll do in a situation like that is Nikka Ko, just to see what happens. I mean, there's a number of things I'll do. One of them is not answer at all. And that creates a disturbance, because here's somebody coming on, sort of naked in the midst of these males asking for sex and then not responding. So what kind of disturbance does this create? What kind of people will then try to hack into my site to find out who I am? More to the point, what I did in one case is I came on like that, and then about every 5 seconds, I started sending out a line of a Paul Celan poem about the Holocaust. And not responding to anybody. So I've created this thing where I'm sending out these poem lines. Paul Celan is a fairly abstract poet, so when it starts, people can think, yeah, he's sort of writing, or she's sort of writing, elliptically to me, because the writing's abstract, so people start identifying with, which increases the number of messages at first, and then I realize something else is going on, and it gets very disturbing. And then the males will start withdrawing, and the screen will go back to white. Again, black letters on white, will go back to white, and they'll start talking among themselves about who is Nikka Ko, what's going on, and they're doing this publicly. I imagine they're also doing this privately, but I get to hear the public part of it, of course. And they'll start talking about who is Nikka Ko, and they'll decide I'm a bot. A bot is a robot piece of software. That will just spew out text. So they'll decide I'm a bot, and then if they start probing too deeply in my computer, I'll get offline before I get my computer hacked too badly, because people are really good at hacking into internet relay chat. So this is an example of where Nikka Ko will go into an application online where there's an audience. She'll go on as myself, and she'll make these kinds of interferences. There's a lot of other things that she's done. The worst thing she's ever done is gone online and kicked everybody else that she could find offline using what's called war software. It's literally designed, it's made by like 14-year-olds. It's really interesting because it's all spelled bad, like the introduction and the help stuff is spelled bad, but it works beautifully. So you can do what's called flooding channels, or jump from channel to channel, or avoid being what's called banned, this kind of thing. And so you can go on. So there's these texts I wrote where Nikka Ko, they were written under the name Nikka Ko Rages, where Nikka Ko would go on, get infuriated at being attracted to, and kick everybody else off, and then jump off before somebody got her. So it's like working with these kinds of identities. A lot of times it's a lot more peaceful than that. Jennifer and Julie will go on to a Talker or a Moo or a Mud. These are text-based virtual realities. So Jennifer and Julie will log in separately, which I can do from my machine, log in multiple times. And they'll have a conversation, a philosophical conversation back and forth, and then that will be recorded and logged, and that will be sent out. Basically what I try to do is push things to the limit in a way with these characters so that it's almost pushing me into a state of psychosis. The writing gets more and more interesting to me to do, the more uncomfortable it gets, the more that I feel that I'm working some kind of edge where I might get into troubles, where I might psychologically start feeling troubled because I'm giving away too much or not giving away enough. this kind of thing. So there's always these edges that are emerging with these characters. They're used a lot also to explore systems. Like on my home computer, I run Linux, which is a Unix system, which most of the internet, 73% of the internet runs on Unix, which is an operating system. The main mail system in Unix is called SendMail, which is a software program for sending email. Most of the programs that use email on the internet work through SendMail one way or another. So I use SendMail on my Linux box, and I use it to send messages very raw out on the internet, but I can, because it's on my box, as opposed to being at an internet service provider or AOL or at a school, I can go in and mess about with the configuration files. I can start changing all kinds of things and then sending messages under strange names. So Jennifer, for example, has sent messages out to email lists from jennifer@jennifer.com. You know, there is actually a jennifer.com, but I found out there's no Jennifer on it. But they'll start sending out these weird messages to email lists under other names. A real short message that Jennifer sent out, for example, and this is like the simplest short thing, was sent to a number of lists. Alan says I'm not to write to you anymore. He says I'm too weird and contrary and stuff and making a mess of his life. He hates it that I keep raising my pinafore. I'll raise my pinafore all I want. He can't stop me. Signed, Jennifer. And on an email list, it would look like Jennifer is like complaining about Alan on the list. It creates this very strange kind of tension on the list. Generally, when with these kinds of posts, I would get two kinds of email. There would be people writing to me saying, my God, I thought your real name was Jennifer, and now I realize you're Alan. And there are also people who would be writing me saying, I think you're crazy. Are you institutionalized? Are you psychotic? Are you on drugs? This kind of thing. The reason that I'm doing this is a number of reasons that I'm working with this, and the two main ones have to do with the future of the internet. One of the ways that the internet is going, and people talk about this continuously, is towards what I call seamless virtual reality. You can imagine 20 or 30 years from now when the bandwidth increases, the electronic bandwidth increases large enough that people will be able to go on to the internet, and it will be, in some areas at least, like the holodeck that you see in Star Trek, that it will feel as if you're in another reality that's a three-dimensional reality with touch and sight and smell and taste capabilities, just like the world we live in. You can almost think of our own real reality here as a virtual reality that's seamless. And if you say the right word or press the right mouse button, you'll jump out of it into a reality that's more real in a way. So the internet is going towards that. So we're going towards a state where we're going to all be avatars or take on more and more avatar-like characteristics. The chats that are opening up all over on the corporate sites right now are examples of that. You go on a chat, you take on an identity. If you fall in love with a man or a woman on the chat, you're very likely to be wondering about who they really are behind their projection and what kind of projection you're pushing forth and so forth. So the real issue is centering around avatars in terms of a future seamless virtual reality, and these issues are already starting to appear. The other thing that's been of real interest to me with these characters and with working on the internet are issues of the body. What does it mean when you're in a global communication space or in a global community, and the only way you have to communicate is through text or occasionally sending images or using see you, see me, very rough video back and forth? Well, the one thing that you realize immediately is that whatever you're doing, even if you're using see you, see me or sending images, everything you're sending off on the internet is digital, okay? So because it's digital, it's what I call the constituted body. There is no Jennifer other than texts, other than bits and bytes, other than little pieces of images that I may put up. She's the totality of her communication structure, of her outpouring. She only exists as communication. There is no other reality beyond communication. If I go to sleep tonight, I'm still in my body. I may have dreams. I get up. There's a lot I do alone. I take my body with me. Jennifer, as communication, can leap from site to site, from router to router, from one place to another, from application to application, from one level of an application to another level of application. It's a totally constituted being. So to the extent that you're online and you push yourself online, online. In other words, you're having, say, net sex with someone, which, in case you don't know what net sex is, it's usually described as somebody typing with one hand. If you're having net sex with someone, or talking intimately with someone, or presenting yourself to someone as a potential partner, or even going into a business deal with someone, all of these things, demand that you present your body. People are trying to read you through the symptoms that you're presenting online. For example, if you're in a chat area where somebody can see you typing the words as you're doing it, examples of this, if you're on ICQ, I don't know if any of you use ICQ, or you use Powwow, or you use YTalk and Unix, any of these, as you type each letter, the letter appears on the screen. So if you make an error, if I type the name Alan, but I put 4 L's in it, I can then backspace, obviously to erase like you would generally do, and the other person will actually see the backspacing and the correction going on at the same time. Okay? So when you do something like that, then you have like the semblance of a body. I mean, not only am I saying things online, but somebody is watching how the typing is appearing. And that represents the way my fingers are moving on a keyboard. It gets to be very eerie sometimes. It's more of a representation than if you're just typing on a chat line where you're typing in a little slot and then hit enter and the whole sentence appears all at once. If the sentence appears all at once, it's a fait accompli. You don't know when it was typed. You don't see how it was being put on. The times I've been talking to someone online, like flirting, for example, on ICQ or on one of these things, where the woman will want me to see a text but doesn't want to acknowledge that she's written a text. So she'll write something like, I really want to grab your balls, and then she'll erase it real fast and then type below it, oops. So she'll backspace. So you'll see the text appear and then suddenly erased and an oops below. So it's like a body saying something or whispering something or coming towards you and withdrawing. And, oh my God, this is going to fall over. Woo! Another thing that enters into this, along the same line as this text appearing and disappearing, these kinds of representations of the body, is the very thing of lag itself. If you're talking to someone in Tasmania, like I'm having sort of I'm flirting with someone in Tasmania, and we may end up doing some projects together and stuff. When I'm talking to her, sometimes there'll be a delay, or sometimes the application will crash itself because there are so many routers, there's so many in-between machines between me and her, that the line will literally be broken somewhere and won't be reconstituted. And you'll get into these very strange states where, for example, we'll be looking at each other in video and then typing in one chat application back and forth to each other, and then that application will break down and the video will go black, and we'll open up another application to type. So you may have 3 or 4 different ways of communicating with someone open all at the same time. So this all has to do with body representations in cyberspace. It gets even more interesting in a lot of the virtual reality environments that are there, where you can enter your own descriptions. Like if you're in what's called a talker, you can put a one-line description. So I can say, describe Alan as, elderly gentleman who's interested in Japan. And then you can also type in a profile that somebody could access in a longer format so that they could get a more full description, which could be true or false. So there's all sorts of ways of representing the body that way as well. What happens also on the internet, when suppose you're in a relationship, and again, by relationship I can mean anything from sex to a business relationship to even student-teacher relationships that are online. What happens when the relationship intensifies? And here's where you find that what goes on very often is you start to get towards increasing bandwidth. It'll start off small and the bandwidth will expand, and there'll be an attempt to make things more and more real. So as an example, on an email list, you find somebody you're interested in on an email list. They just sent a post out, you've read the post, and you're attracted to what's being said. So you may do what's called back channel them, or you private message them. It means the same thing. You're writing them off the email list personally to say, gee, I like that email post. So you've gone from the public space, the public global space, to a private space that's one-to-one, that's text-based. You may then eventually find out you have something in common with this person, and you'll start writing more and more back and forth. You've increased the bandwidth a little. You're writing a little more letters than you used to. And then suddenly you'll think, well, I sort of want to know what this person looks like. So you'll start exchanging pictures, okay, back and forth. And this is still, everything is still being done online. You're sending the pictures online, you're doing everything online. You may start having net sex then, and if you start doing net sex, you may go to a chat room where you can talk back and forth to each other, or you go to See You, See Me, where you can see each other's bodies, or you'll go to internet phone. But when you reach the phone stage, it's very interesting because the phone for me is a division, and I've noticed this with a lot of people. You can have people who are flirting back and forth and having sex and living in a pretend state in relationship to each other, a fantasy state, where they're projecting their own bodies, but there's no real sign of their bodies. I mean, there's photographs, yes, but the photographs could be of anyone, and the photographs are also distanced. Even the video is distanced. But when you get to phone, when you finally make a phone call, which, and again, notice how the bandwidth is increasing. You've left the internet now, you're just using the telephone. Generally, iPhone is still not that common on the internet. So you're using a real telephone and you're talking with someone, it suddenly becomes intimate. It suddenly has crossed the barrier. So you'll find a lot of married couples online talking intimately to each other, like a husband from one couple talking to a wife of another, and their spouse is not knowing. And they'll be talking back and forth, typing, exchanging pictures, hiding all the stuff on their computer when their spouse is in the room. And then suddenly it comes to the point, either he or she will say, "I'd like to hear your voice." And when that happens, then things start to get very real very fast, and that's where you start to get the divorces coming in, where you start to get people meeting in real life, people sending packages or real life letter. So there's always a sort of hysteric element to it, in the sense of Freudian hysteria, not the way that feminists are using it, that you have a symptom standing for a trauma of the body. Okay, which is how Freud defines hysteria. You have a symptom like a twitch in the arm that stands for something that happened to you or you believe happened to you when you were younger. So when you're looking at the internet, you have only a virtual body, and all of these texts that you have going out, the email going out, the chats that are going out, all of these are like symptoms of a full body that's elsewhere. You know, so it gets to be very hysteric. You start to want to inhabit the symptom more and more. The symptom is standing for a whole world. The trauma is that your body is not present in relationship to the other person. It's that very trauma that also makes it possible for you to talk intimately with that other person because you're not present in your fullness. So you'll have people on the internet saying, "I'm just fooling around with someone," you know, or "we're just writing back and forth," but they'll be telling intimate secrets that they've told no one ever in their life. You get an intimacy very fast. If it goes in a direction of net sexuality, that'll very often happen in the first week or two, even with people who are sexually repressed or who have never had any interest in sexual experimentation. Everything happens fast. And then it reaches sort of these crisis moments. If it becomes real life, when you and your partner, who is 8,000 miles away or, you know, 2 states away or whatever, tries to figure out a way to get together in real life, and you find your whole life is suddenly centered around a geography which beforehand you had never paid any attention to. You know, suddenly you're concerned. For example, I have a girlfriend in Japan who I moved to Japan to live with her for 6 months. She's an Australian, so she went up. I was this way. She's teaching in Japan. And while we were together, and for the first couple of months after we were apart, my inner time frame, my subjective horizon, phenomenological horizon, the way I inhabited time was always split, so that I was always aware of not only what time it was where I was, my local time, but I was aware of my Japanese time, the Fukuoka time, because that was the time she was under. So when we would talk, we would be continuously aware, like I would be calling her in the early evening, and she would be in the early morning, where we were 13 hours apart. So you're always aware of these sort of dual time zones that are going on. So the body starts to split that way. as well. So on one hand, I mean, just to get it back to architecture, global community, I mean, it's kind of fascinating because on one hand, I mean, for me, architecture, even imaginary architecture or idealized architecture or things like Archigram or Lebbeus Woods and all of that is still grounded in the potential for moving into space. It's why I like Stephen Perella's work, because Stephen Perella has really developed an architecture based, at least the things he's shown me, based on internet. But by and large, I think of architecture as inert, as model making on some level, as drawing, you know, these kinds of activities. And then on the other hand, on the internet, through these spaces, you can just slide and slide indefinitely. Here's how you build a house on the internet. If I want to build a house, if I'm on a Moo, for example, which is one of those text-based virtual realities, all I have to do to build a house is type the words @dig, the @ @dig thing called house. That's it. And I will then get a response from the system saying you have now created a thing called house. Number, and it will give me a number for it. I can then, you want to build a 2-story house, you can put @describe house as 2-story. It will then say description set. You can actually make real entrances and exits to the house. So, for example, you can have an exit going north that will then connect to somebody else's house on the Moo, which somebody that you know. So you can. There are commands for building doors, for building exits, for adding rooms, for making the rooms talk. You can have furniture in the house. My room has a human in it, for example. I mean, I built a little house. It's got a human in it. It says the human is squeezable. When you read that you're on the Moo, you know, I've now created a human being, and it says human being is squeezable. So you type squeeze human, and it says fluids flow from human, which is fairly yucky. It says fluids flow from human. Now that's very simple, you know, it's real simple programming, but that's all it takes to create these kinds of objects. And again, the objects they're not objects at all, they're nothing but program codes. The programming that you're writing in is what's called object-oriented programming, like C++, things like that. But it's basically just program codes that you're doing, and you can make very, very elaborate structures. They're starting to move this now into other forms of virtual realities, so that it won't only be text-based, but the deeper and the longer, the earlier and the broadest communities are all text-based. The main Moo that's still running is Lambda Moo, which has something like 16,000 people on it. So I got very interested in ways of representing the body on the internet and writing sort of very, very extreme text to see what the results would be. There's a woman in Perth, Australia by the name of Kim McLean. I mean, she's a real person in Australia. And she and I started writing, this is about 2 years ago, we wrote a series of net sex texts. We would have net sex, but we would set up parameters that would imply things like cannibalism or the body turning inside out. Since it was all textual, you could do that. And then we would log the result of all of this and then send it to the email list, okay? So we're writing these very extreme texts where we're trying to make the body as visible as possible by making people uncomfortable reading the text. In other words, the texts were so filled with effluvia and debris and excrement and vomit and body parts and devourings and couplings of all sorts that people would get uncomfortable, but it would also start making them react, their own bodies react to the text that they were reading. So we sent a whole series of texts out like that, and sure enough, everybody took them for reality. And it was interesting, again, in terms of gender difference between men and women, because we both got a ton of email. Kim, as a woman, got a lot of email from males who were writing things like, hi, I can't write as well as you and Alan, but I'd really like to have net sex with you. Would you mind having net sex with me? Taking it, in other words, that what we were doing was basically a come on for other people, and they wanted to have sex, and it was sort of like right to the core. On the other hand, you would have women writing to me saying, Alan, are you all right? These texts are so extreme. You know, I wonder if you're okay. Is there anything I can do for you? So you have this sort of gender division that was coming out of that, and then I was able to write a lot of text about that or start thinking about the way even those gender relationships were working online. So the second thing I've been doing, in other words, is working out of these avatars. Since we're losing people, I'm going to end this soon and then open it up to questions. What I've been doing is sort of working out of these avatars. A third thing I'm doing, which is not really a place to go into here, is dealing with trying to find formal mechanisms for dealing with the kinds of communications that are on the internet. And I've developed a whole theory of what I call sadomasochisms, which are really have nothing to do with sexual sadomasochism, but are sort of couplings between controls and slaves, things that are controlling and things that are controlled. Like when you type a key, you hit the letter O, then the typing is a control and the O is a result, and trying to build up a theory out of these kinds of things. Okay, so it's 1 o'clock. Are there any questions? Does anybody have any questions at all?
I'd like to just, in your efforts to define, very, very, very curious about is there a geography to the body as well as a geography to the overall internet, and how
I gave a talk at Northridge a few years ago where I talked about 5 geographies, thinking about geography. One was a traditional geography of topography. One was a geography of nomadicisms, wanderings. One was a geography of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is literally, how is the spectrum allocated, and that also goes into the geography of the internet. One was a geography of the body, and how the body plays or displays itself along lines of flight or within different communities. So there is that kind of geography that does develop. One of the things that happens online is that so much is centered on sight. The person wants to see the other person desperately. As things develop. People, when they meet in what's called a flesh meet from internet connections, they want to know what each other's looks like. There's constant projections and introjections going on back and forth. If you don't know what the other person looks like, you start imagining it. And I talk about sort of fictional embodiments in this way, because not only, if you describe yourself as tall and blonde, I may add that to my description of you, to how I picture you, but I may also say, no, I think he's lying, or no, well, maybe he's pretending, or maybe he's not so tall. Maybe tall means something different to him than it does to me. So you start reading, you start deconstructing on a very primitive level, but you're deconstructing what the other person is saying, constantly adjusting the fit. It's what I call handshaking, and it's where those S&M's couplings come in. The couplings are not based on what you're saying to me, but they're based on mutual orientation of domains, of how I'm reading you and how you're writing me, and so forth and so on, all of these kinds of things.
And those topographies, are they always described in terms of a kind of literary text, or does it ever flip over into a more, for lack of a better word, objective use of
it seems to flip. When you start using...
The code always is very objective, if it is not, or the path, the routing.
Well, the routing is objective, but the routing is also like a skein in the sense that if packets don't go through one way, they go through another. Except on internet relay chat, and some other applications, that gets really technical. But CUC-Me is sort of important in all of this, and I wish I knew more about CUC-Me communities. There's not anything written on them. A lot of the CUC-Me communities are private. CUC-Me is a very primitive video application. Cyber cafes used to have them when there were cyber cafes. That was a fad. But you would have a little spherical camera on top of your Mac, and the camera would show you to someone else, and you could see other people, and you could have 7 or 8 screens open up of these 1 by 1 inch, generally, images of the other person. And this is incredibly powerful. I mean, I remember one of the few times I've gotten chills on the internet was when I started using CUC-Me and contacted a scientist in McMurdo Sound, Antarctica. So I'm talking to somebody on Antarctica, and he has a live presence on my computer screen, and that was really eerie for me. Now you sort of take that stuff for granted, but at that point, that was really eerie for me. And there seems to be a veracity, if you're talking to someone on CUC-Me, you can see when they're looking down and typing and sending the replies to you. Generally, the images are fairly boring, but you get a look at the feeling of what the other person looks like. So it's a different kind of reading. than you get in a text. But even there, because See You, See Me is so primitive, and because it's so primitive, you tend to do this kind of like reading, projecting, interjecting, reading and writing the other, even through the visual image. It gets very strange if you're having net sex with someone, for example. And I'm not trying to emphasize the sex too much, but it's one area which pushes the bandwidth. Very often, if See You, See Me doesn't work, somebody will have a digital camera and they'll be taking pictures while they're talking to the other person. And so the other person will have some graphic application open on the screen, so they'll be able to look at the pictures, which might come in once every 3 or 4 minutes, of the other person. But they could also be pictures they just downloaded from some news group. It doesn't have to be, have any more reality than that, although they usually do. That's the other thing about the net, is that people are usually in a lot of the areas, like moos and mud, moos, not mud so much, but in moos and on email lists, people are usually who they say they are, or they very quickly adjust to who they say they are. They don't keep up pretense for too long. So most of the net relationships that have started, there's that saying on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, which I think is a really ugly saying, but I've heard that thrown at me a few times. But in fact, on the internet, you generally know and it's an insult to dogs, and it's a term that's been used pejoratively with women, which makes me sort of angry. But in fact, most people, when they do meet from the internet, do have some fairly good idea of what each other looks like and how each other's going to respond. They're sensitive to that if they're going to meet. On the other hand, there's some cases I know of, very few, but a couple cases I know of where a male was really just nasty in real life and was just trying to seduce as many women as possible. Eventually, I think you're going to see with all of this stuff, there was a writer out here by the name of Josh White years ago when I was teaching at UCI, and he was talking about the notion of invisible colleges, that people sort of talk or become comfortable with people who may be all over the country physically. This is before the internet, who are all over the country physically, but who you have stuff in common with. Like I'm working on a certain kind of psychoanalytical theory or a certain kind of postmodern geographical theory. There may be other people who have that in common with me, and I'd be making calls to Cincinnati and so forth. And you would at that point meet at seminars or conferences or read each other's work in journals. But now you have these invisible colleges that are opening up all over the place. So people are getting to know each other through that. And you may find that the people you're closest to are people who are physically at a great distance from you, but who you share a lot in common with. So because of that, there's a very subtle social realignment that's occurring right now through the internet. You find couples splitting up. You find people paying less attention to their offline friends because they have more in common with their online friends. It's more intense. They feel more comfortable with them, and they even very often will feel more comfortable with them when they meet them in real life. So I think as more people get online, and we could talk about, although the crowd's still thinning out, we could talk about universal accessibility. As the globe becomes more and more accessible, as these communities become less and less class structured. Right now they're intolerably class structured, and for that matter they may stay that way. But as they potentially become less class structured, you'll find more and more social realignments and more empowerments of disempowered groups, such as Chiapas Indians in Mexico, and what's called InfoWar that's going on down there, because of people having access to the internet and finding other kinds of leverages in the culture. Maybe we should stop it there then, I think, at this point. Thank you.
Glass of wine. It's a problem.
It's what?
Glass of wine.
I mean, at least you've got it on tape, and I don't think I made any horrific errors, like something I'd be embarrassed about on tape. So at least we have it on tape.
Would you like to? You can actually dub.
It would be nice to get a copy of that. Yeah.
Why don't we?
I should give this back to you guys. I felt bad that there weren't more people here, because I also feel that this stuff is relevant to architecture, very directly relevant to architecture.
It is.